Going to start slow again, kind of like with InfoPath. We started slow. We just did some simple things and then got more complex. Same thing here with workflow. We're going to start with some fairly simple things and we're going to get more complex. All right, so with SharePoint Designer, we're going to build custom workflows the easy way, and I need to be making the air quotes when I say easy. So it's easier than Visual Studio and going down that learning curve of how to be a .NET developer. But it's not exactly simple, okay? In SharePoint Designer, nothing happens until you open a site. So we can download and install SharePoint Designer. It's a free application. You put it on your own machine. It does not need to be installed on the server. You do install it just on your own local machine, and that's fine. You'll need credentials. You need to be able to be a site owner, generally, would be the best credentials to have. And you'll open up that site in SharePoint Designer. Once you do open that site, you're going to see that there's a lot you can do with SharePoint Designer, and that it's a very robust site management tool. Pretty much everything you could do from the browser, from the user interface, in terms of site management, list, library management, permissions, columns, all that kind of stuff, you could do it from inside of SharePoint Designer. Most of the stuff that I can do from the browser, I still just go ahead and do it from the browser because it's kind of where I'm used to doing it. But it might be that the more you work with SharePoint Designer, you might get real excited about what you can do here. There are things that you can really only do from SharePoint Designer, like the workflows we're going to work on. External content types, that's going to be developed here, and external lists, those two things are developed in SharePoint Designer and not anywhere else. Data views, building data view web parts and data form web parts, that's done here in SharePoint Designer and not in the browser. So there are some things that I come here because it's the only place to do it. And then of course things like branding, master pages, page layouts, page templates, those kinds of things are all customized, and the development work for those happen in SharePoint Designer. Okay, there are three types of workflows that you can create. You can create a list workflow. So if you just want to associate a workflow with a list or a library, like our project task form library, then you can just simply create a list workflow. Okay? You can also create what's called a reusable workflow. And a reusable workflow is one that can be associated with other lists or libraries in other sites, or it can be associated with a content type. So let's say we've got an AdventureWorks policy workflow, because we have those HR policies that I just talked about, but we have IT policies that are pretty closely related to HR policies. And we might have other kind of policies for safety or manufacturing or procurement or other kinds of things. And when those policies are created, they kind of have the effect of law within AdventureWorks. And so no matter what department you're in, if you're going to create one of these policies, we want a common workflow to work on all of those. So we could create a reusable workflow. We could associate it with a content type of AdventureWorks policy, which the parent of which would just be simply a Word document. Okay, we're gonna open up Word, but we're really going to be creating a policy. So it'll be of the AdventureWorks policy content type, and this reusable workflow can be associated with that content type. The third kind of workflow we can create is a site workflow, and I don't even need it. I can't figure out how to use it or why. I don't understand what they were thinking. A site workflow does not run in the context of an item. There is no item. There's no trigger that can make this workflow run automatically. Site workflows can only be kicked off manually. You have to start them manually. The few places I've seen, some examples of a site workflow is, if I've got a site and I want you to give me feedback on that site, I could have a site workflow and a little button that when you click the button, it starts the site workflow. It asks you some questions. On a scale of 9 to 10, rate Kevin's website. Okay, you're going to rate it as a 9 or a 10. Is it rate the usability, rate the look and feel, rate the overall design? Did you understand the purpose? Yes or no? Any additional questions or any additional notes you have for Kevin? That workflow can kick off. It can ask you questions, and then the workflow can be looking at who you are and whether you gave me a 9 or a 10, or it could be sending me an email with all that information compiled in it. And I mean, that's fine, but I could also have just had a SharePoint list, right? And you could have clicked a button, it would have popped open a list item form, and I could have asked you the exact same questions in a list item. And then I could have fired off a workflow as soon as you clicked save. And or maybe I've heard people using a site workflow if you want to request a site. So if you want a site provisioned, you could request a site through a site workflow that again would ask you questions. But again, I think it would be more valuable to have a SharePoint list, the site provision request list, so that when you request a site, that's an item that's going into a list that has a created date and a created by and a modified date and so on, and we can run a workflow there, and we can always refer back to that list item. So I'm not too big on site workflows, and I may be missing something. There may be some like really great purpose for them that I've just am blind to, but we are generally going to be making list. I think we are only making list workflows in class. Ken?
Yeah, I was going to say, I just looked it up in their help system, which is often not helpful.
Yeah.
But it just says you can think of a site workflow as a general site-wide process.
Yeah.
So maybe that's our mechanism for getting workflows out of the particular, site-wide.
If a SharePoint Designer workflow, okay, so here's one reason you might want to do a site workflow. If you had Workflow Essentials from SharePoint Solutions and you created some workflows that would loop through a list, like loop through something, because remember I said we have that problem of you're not getting notified if something just keeps getting older, if nothing triggers it. We could have a site workflow that would loop through and trigger a workflow on every item that would now know that it's gone from 3 days out, which was okay, to 2 days out that's no longer okay. So, but again, without that extra capability that's not out of the box, it doesn't seem as important. Okay, so we've got a bunch of actions to choose from, just like we had actions in InfoPath. We could set a field's value, we could submit the form, we could close the form, we could choose it, we could switch views. Here we have a ton more actions, lots of things. We can send an email, or create an item, or update an item, or set a variable, or stop the workflow, or lots of different actions that our workflow can do. Conditions control if the actions will occur. So if the condition evaluates to true, then those actions will fire. Steps allow you to group conditions and actions together. Steps also allow for this right here. And what is this? That's commenting our code. Okay?
Oh.
That's describing what's happening. Okay? Steps give you the opportunity to say what's going on in this portion of your workflow. I could have had all three of these
lumped into one.
yeah, I could have called this step 1, collect data, update the item, and email the person that created it.
So organization and stuff.
Yeah. So by calling it step 1, I wouldn't have really known what it was doing, and by crowding them all together, it's not terrible, it's okay. It would work exactly the same as this one. But in 8 weeks, when you ask me to come back to this workflow and make some changes to it, I'll be happier looking at this than I would looking at a workflow where it just says step 1 and everything's all, crammed together. Okay, how are we going to get this workflow built? Visio would be great. A pencil and paper would work fine, but we need to kind of understand what's going on. So I've got some conditions here, and depending on a condition, I'm going to take an action. Okay, so it looks like I'm setting a field's value on the current item, and if that item is a policy, we're going to review it in 6 months, and if the item is a benefit, I'm going to review it in a year. And if it's some other kind of document, I'm going to review it in 2 years. Okay, so then we take that pencil and paper, and step 1 in SharePoint Designer, if we're creating a list workflow, we need to pick the list. So I'm in the HR site. Actually, I'm in the marketing site, but we'll pretend I'm in HR. This is our marketing approval, I guess. That's fine. So which list or library is my workflow going to be associated with? I need to give it a name. I would give it kind of a short name, because this is going to become the name of a column on your list or library. So big, long, verbose names can be a little bit painful when you're looking at that list view or that library view. Make your description just as long as you want. Okay, descriptions are good. Then you need to think about, how will this workflow fire? Is it going to be started manually or automatically when something's created, or automatically when something's changed? What's the best way to start a workflow? All right, step 3. And this is optional, and this is only used if you're starting the workflows manually. There's something called an initiation parameter. Initiation parameter, that's a way for you to ask questions. Okay, so we're going to do this. You're going to go to the HR site, and there's a document library there, and when somebody puts in a document, they're going to fire the workflow manually, and you're going to say, what kind of document is it? And they're going to say, well, it's a benefit, or it's a policy, or it's a general. And based on the answer, the workflow can use those answers and do things. Okay? But you're going to see that Kendra's idea is a lot better. Don't start it manually, and don't ask these questions, because that's great metadata to tag those documents with. Not just asking people at the time the workflow runs, but ask them when they save the document to that library. What kind of document is it? And then you don't need initiation parameters. You don't need to start it manually, and you probably won't use this much. Okay? But you need to know that it's there, and you can use it. Okay, then we get back into our steps and start putting in our conditions and our actions to build out our actual workflow. All right. Similar to InfoPath, when we created a form template, in WorkFlow, we're creating an instance of the workflow. I mean, we're creating like a workflow template, and an instance of that workflow can run on any or every item in that list or library. It can be in progress on more than one item at one time. It could be in progress on every item at one time. It can't be in progress more than once on one item at one time. Okay? All right. So let me show you a couple things in SharePoint Designer. All right, so you guys are going to do this. You're going to create a list workflow for the documents library in HR, and maybe just watch for right now, because I'm going to do some things that might not be the same as the book. So I'm going to just call this my test workflow, and so that takes me right to what I think I was calling step 4 of this process. So step 1 was selecting the list and the library. Step 2 was going over here to the workflow settings and deciding how is it that this workflow is going to start. And sometimes when I'm building and testing and debugging, I leave manually started available, even though I think that I'll probably turn that off and that my users won't start it manually. Sometimes I leave that turned on because I just want to keep refiring the workflow on the same item without modifying it or without creating a new one or whatever. Then the initiation parameters, that's the optional step 3, which is where we would go in and set up questions that we want to ask the user when they start it manually. Okay, initiation parameters, it probably says, yeah, initiation form parameters collect data when this workflow is started manually.
So is that data stored anywhere, or are they just decision diamonds?
Yeah, that would just, the data's not stored anywhere unless you store it somewhere. It's stored in a workflow variable that can be used, you know, in that session, but you could put them somewhere. You could create a list item and put it there. You could update the current item and put it there. You could put them in an email that gets sent out to somebody. Okay. So then once you're in this place, once you go look at the workflow settings and you need to edit the workflow, it's not all that intuitive, but you need to click right here where it says Edit Workflow under Customization. That brings you back to what I was calling step 4, okay? Getting started, building out your actions and your conditions. We've got conditions here. If the condition evaluates to true, the actions associated with that condition will run. We don't have to have a condition. Conditions are optional. The actions are what the workflow is going to do. I'm going to just simply log a message to the history list. Does this workflow work? And I'm going to publish it. Publishing it saves it. You could be working on a workflow. You could continually save it and never publish it until you're ready. Publishing it saves it, and it publishes it out to that list or library. If I go back to my documents library and I upload a document, browse out somewhere, sample documents. So you may come to My Documents, go into Sample Documents, and you can upload a document. What we're going to see is we're going to see a new column in our default view. I'm I didn't delete my doc type column, and it's required, so I'm going to put that in there. We're going to see a new column once IE restarts. And there it is. It's the name that I gave to my workflow, test workflow. Test workflow has completed. It looks like a hyperlink, and it is. This takes us to the workflow status page for the instance of the workflow that ran on that item. And we can see when it started, the last time it ran, what the status of the workflow is, a link back to the document that the workflow instance ran on, any tasks that might have been assigned to somebody, and there were none, anything that was logged to the workflow history list, which was that comment, does this workflow work? The answer is yes, the workflow's working. Okay, so let's go back here to my workflow. I want to log something different to my workflow. We could just log something out of that current item. Okay, so our list and our library workflows always are running in the context of an item. In this case, it's that 401k whatever benefit document that I just uploaded. When we get to the next module, or I don't know, in a couple modules we're going to get back around to that form we created. We're going to create the workflows for that form. The current item will be whichever project task form just got submitted or just got updated. Okay, so the current item, we could log anything out of the current item, like it's who created it, or when, or the name, the title. So we could take any field out of it, but there's another thing we can do that's really nice, and we can use this string builder. Okay, so we can say, does this workflow work? And the answer is yes. This document is a lookup. We're going to look up something. We're going to get the current items doc type. It was created on lookup current item created by current item created by. Okay, so this actually can be helpful. We'll talk about it again later in terms of debugging and troubleshooting and trying to figure out what's going wrong with your workflows. Logging information to the history list can be very beneficial. So let's publish it again. Let's come back over here. Let's upload another document, the benefit overview document. We're going to say it's a benefit document. The workflow's in progress. It's probably actually completed. So we'll just refresh, and it has completed. And so what do we have? Does this workflow work? Yes. This document is a benefit. It's created on today by me. Okay, so that's just a simple thing to get you started. You're actually going to use the parameters. You're going to have to start it manually. Then you're going to jettison the whole parameter track, and you're going to add a doc type column. So we're going to use the Kendra method when we add the doc type column, and then your workflow is just going to simply do a little lookup to the current item's doc type, log it out there to the history list. Next module will get a little more complex. We're going to take some actions. We're going to update a field, the review the review date field, and if it's this, we're going to do one thing. If it's something else, we'll do a different thing.